I am so excited to be in Alaska. This is my first trip here. It is quite cold, but it is quite beautiful, and I am so happy to be able to share with you all today. I'm going to invite you for a few minutes into my world, into my brain, which sometimes can be a very strange place to be. I have written a book called The Fight for Life, Taking It to the Street, that chronicles my experiences when I was the Director of Minority Outreach for Georgia Right to Life. That was quite the roller coaster ride for both myself and for Ryan. We did one of the most successful pro-life campaigns, I think, ever, of course. When I was with Georgia Right to Life, we put up that billboard that said, "Black children are an endangered species." And it literally changed the conversation about life in the nation. So that was an exciting time for me. I am a founding core member of the National Black Pro-Life Coalition. I also have my own organization called the Restoration Project, and you see my email there. If any of you want to email me, I would love it. I also have a blog, which I was derelict for not putting up there, called talkaboutitcd.blogspot.com. And I don't write as prolifically as Matt. I only write when I feel compelled to say something, so you'll see large gaps, but I am really focusing in and honing in on the life issue right now and doing it for a reason. So today we're going to talk about personhood. Why is personhood important to the pro-life movement? Charles Darwin is the guy that we know about the theory of evolution, right? Did you know, does anybody know what the subtitle of his book was?
Origin of Species.
Origin of the Species. See, nobody knows. His book was Origin of the Species, the Preservation of Favored Races. The whole theory of evolution, the whole doctrine that he promoted, stripped God out of the equation. He said we were not, in fact, made in the image and likeness of God. We were nothing. And this big bang happened, and we evolved. And he felt like there were way too many people in the earth. Then there was food. So we had to preserve the favored races. And who were the favored races? White Anglo-Saxon Protestants. Couldn't be black people. He said, no, black people are evolved from the apes. That's where we got this whole notion originally of blacks not being people. Years later, Margaret Sanger came along. And Margaret Sanger was a eugenicist. Everybody know what eugenics is? Eugenics is built off of preservation of the favored races. And they said certain people should be allowed to have children at will, and others needed their birth rate controlled because they were undesirable. They were defectives. They were not worthy of life. They had no value in life. And then finally, it's Alan Guttmacher. Most of us don't talk about Alan Guttmacher, but he is the father of abortion on demand. He took over Margaret Sanger's organization, Planned Parenthood, in the 1960s, and he single-handedly redefined the definition of a woman's health to include her psychological health as well as her physical health. And because he said that psychologically a woman was being adversely impacted, we got abortion on demand. It started in New York, where the headquarters of Planned Parenthood is located. So back in the day, during slavery, we had to be able to justify having slaves. We had to be able to write something that says it's okay for you to have slaves and own them, because why? They're not people. So we had these things called slave codes, and slave codes define the status of the slaves and the rights of the masters. It restricted the slaves' behavior, and it reduced slaves to property status. So the slave codes were the first things that we had in the United States that removed the blacks from personhood. An example, in Virginia in 1662 was a slave code that says, whereas some doubts have arisen whether children got by any Englishman upon a Negro shall be a slave or free, be it therefore enacted and declared by this present Grand Assembly that all children born in this country shall be held bond or free only according to the condition of the mother. So that automatically consigned all children, even though the slave master may have made that child, to the corridors of slavery. They could never be free if their dads were free. It had to go according to the mother. And again, because of the slave codes, they were considered property, not people. Well, the legislative process, the political process said, you know, something's wrong with this picture if we're not going to count the slaves as people. Or you can't have it both ways, Southerners. They're either people or they're not. They can't be people for apportionment purposes and then not be people for applying every other rule or law in the land. So we're not going to let you count all your slaves. And thank God they did that. Because had they not done that, the South would have ruled the day forever, because they were counting all the slaves, and you know we get our representation in Congress based on the population of the particular state. Well, there were more people in the South than there were in the North and in the West because of the slaves. So they said, well, no, slaves are not fully people. We're going to count them for the apportionment purposes as 3/5 of a person. Well, what that in effect did was, if you count all those people, there's 22 slaves in that picture. But according to apportionment, there's only 13 people there, not 22, because each one was counted as 3/5 of a person. So that's known as the 3/5 compromise. So then along comes our illustrious Supreme Court. And let me just tell you why we in the pro-life movement are banking on an expectation that the Supreme Court is going to do the right thing and correct Roe v. Wade is a mystery to me. And it's a mystery to me because that's not their history. Their history has always been to side with the politics of the day. And that's why it's so important when we say we want to make sure that a conservative or a liberal are going to be appointed to the Supreme Court. It's because they're normally going to go with the politics of the day, right? So everyone was so excited that we had Justice Roberts appointed by President Bush, and he was a conservative voice, and he's going to do the right thing, and he's going to stand for life, right? And then we got Obamacare. And what did Justice Roberts do? He followed the politics of the day. He didn't follow the principles under which we thought he was being appointed. And so he says, well, Obamacare is really a tax. Really? So you're going to allow this tax to control what happens with the lives of people? That's what we got with our illustrious Supreme Court. And their history goes all the way back to the beginning. Every opportunity they had to correct the notion of whether or not blacks were people versus property, they went in the direction of their property, beginning with Dred Scott in 1857. Now you have to understand, that case was a case about citizenship. But you must remember that the court said people of the United States and citizens are synonymous. So what they basically said was Dred Scott wasn't a people. He wasn't a person. And since he wasn't a person, he couldn't be a citizen. So since he's not a citizen, he had no standing to sue for his freedom because he wasn't a person. He looks like a person to me. But the court overruled what they could see with their natural eyes and said he wasn't a person. So the legislators, the politicians, we got the 13th Amendment. That amendment in 1865 ended slavery. And then they passed the Civil Rights Act of 1866 that said citizenship, that all people are citizens, and they affirmed the equal protection. They said, if you are a citizen, you're a person, you are equally protected under this Constitution. And then they went even further 2 years later and established the 14th Amendment, which provided equal protection and citizenship for blacks in this country. Even after changing the Constitution and adding the 14th Amendment, we had all of these groups that continued to say blacks were not people. So the politicians came back and they passed the Civil Rights Act of 1871, which was to rein in the KKK during the Reconstruction era, and that act basically gave equal protection and citizenship to blacks, which it had already done under the 14th Amendment. And then we had the Civil Rights Act of 1875, which guaranteed blacks equal treatment in public accommodations, public transportation, and said that they could not exclude us from jury service because we were people, right? It was clear. The intent and the will of the people was clear. And what did the Supreme Court do? In 1896, they came out with Plessy versus Ferguson. And they said, well, you might be people, but you're not equal people. So we can ban you from public transportation, from public accommodations, from jury service, because you're not equal. It took until 1964 for us to get the Civil Rights Act that said you cannot legally discriminate against a person based on their color of their skin. So what did our illustrious Supreme Court do? They passed Roe v. Wade. And Roe v. Wade, they overrode the very Constitution that established personhood, and they created a fictitious right to privacy that overrode the personhood of the child. Even in the oral arguments, Justice Potter looked at Sarah Weddington and said, if it's established that the unborn fetus is a person, within the protection of the 14th Amendment, you would have an almost impossible case, right? And she said, I would have a very difficult case. Why? Because the 14th Amendment established protection and personhood for every citizen of the United States. But the Supreme Court followed their usual pattern and stripped another class of people from the spectrum of humanity. And they said the baby is not a person. And so for 42 years now, we have been fighting and saying, it's a child, not a choice. It's not a blob of tissue or a product of conception, it's a person. But what we haven't done is do what the court exactly said and establish the personhood of the child. It's a person. And yet the Supreme Court has consistently overrode what they could see with their own eyes. When you see a pregnant woman, there's no other species in the universe that we look at it and say, this elephant's having a baby moose, or this elephant is having a baby dog. We call it a baby elephant. We call a baby dog a puppy. We don't take it out of its species, but for the purpose and the sake of being able to destroy life in the womb, we override the 14th Amendment. We create a fictional right of privacy that is not in the Constitution anywhere. And they said, only if the baby in utero is viable. But then they came back and then they stripped that away in the Doe v. Bolton case. And they took the mental health of the mother over the personhood of the child. And they said, well, if the mental health of the mother is impacted, then she has the right of privacy to decide whether or not she wants to have that child. How can that be when it's as clear as the noses on our face what our Constitution says? And unfortunately, those of us in the pro-life movement, rather than standing on the principles that we know, we became political just like everyone else. And we have allowed politics to keep abortion alive for 42 years. Now, people look at me and they say, Catherine, why are you pushing so hard for personhood? Why are you so pro-life, you know? And why are you so impatient? Remember, it took 100 years for us to end slavery, and it took all of this time, an additional 70 years for us to end legal discrimination. So why are you so pumped up about personhood and ending abortion? And the issue is because the difference is, during slavery, contrary to what Spike Lee and some of these other movie people want you to believe, they weren't killing their slaves. The slaves represented an economic value. It determined the economic status of that slave owner. The more slaves you had, the more wealthy you were considered. So they were not wholesale slaughtering their slaves. But today, we are slaughtering babies each and every day. And it is having a definitive impact, particularly in the Black community. Can I share some facts with you? In the Black community, in cities like New York, where Planned Parenthood's headquarters are, for every 1,000 Black babies born alive, 1,489 are aborted. That's depopulation. Planned Parenthood and Margaret Sanger launched the Negro Project back in the 1930s. And the Negro Project paid black ministers and leaders to go and tell black women, it's okay for you to take control of your body and not have children, or be able to evenly space your children. It's okay. We want to give you birth control. We want to give you the means to determine what happens with your body. And that morphed into this whole abortion fight because they are still doing the same thing. This is Black History Month. And last year, during Black History Month, Planned Parenthood honored 98 influencers in the black community, one for every year of their existence. They had every black media outlet that they honored: BET, Ebony, Jet, Essence, all of the magazines that black women look to. They honored pastors. Can you believe there are pastors that say it is okay for you to kill your baby in the womb? And they found them and honored them. They found heads of corporations to honor, to call out and say, aren't you just the most wonderful things since the beginning of time? And oh, by the way, why don't you help black people understand? And so what's happened is we have a death style that has exceeded by 4 or 5 times our presence in populations around this country. And we wonder why we have so many blacks killing other blacks. We wonder why we have so much death in the black community. It starts in the womb. And if you don't have a regard for life in the womb, you certainly are not going to have a regard for anybody walking down the street. And contrary to what they want you to believe, Al and Jesse and the guys want you to believe, black people are not killing white people. White people are not killing black people. Black people are killing black people because of the connection to the Negro Project. So 42 years later, here we are, 42 years later after Roe v. Wade, and we still have wholesale slaughter of children in the womb every single day. And it's the politics that are controlling the matter. I was in D.C. at the March for Life, and I normally don't go to D.C. for the March for Life because I stay in Georgia and march with my comrades in arms in Georgia. But this year I went, and I left D.C. depressed, absolutely depressed. One, because it was like a party. There was no solemnity to us marching for the 50, almost 58 million children now that have been killed. And I was glad to see the young people there. But the young people were marching and they were chanting, Obama, your mama chose life. And then they crack up laughing, ha 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 ha. Or, I love babies, yes I do. I love babies, how about you? Right? But it's like we've forgotten that we are talking about little many us's, little many yous, little many me's that are being torn asunder in the womb every single day. So 58 million later, we know that at least 20 to 25 million of those babies were black. We also know, because Protecting Black Life did a study in 2012 based on the census data, they looked at the locations of Planned Parenthood's surgical centers. And they found out that 79% of Planned Parenthood surgical facilities are within a 2-mile walking radius of a Black or Latina neighborhood. But nobody's saying anything. So I am absolutely pro-personhood. I am absolutely pro the sanctity of human life. And that is the bill that has been introduced in this Congress by Congressman Jody Heiss from Georgia. He was joined by 7 other congressmen, most of whom were from Georgia, in introducing the Sanctity of Human Life bill. Again, it had been introduced in the past by Congressman Paul Brown, but Congressman Heiss picked that bill up. And let me just tell you that we must do everything we can. Forget the 20-week ban. Forget the other Dismemberment Act, because that is not going to save the lives of babies. And let me tell you why. In every state, we have some of the best pro-life laws ever. Matt mentioned Pennsylvania, where Kermit Gosnell was. Pennsylvania had strong pro-life laws on the books. Many of Gosnell's workers reported him to the state of Pennsylvania. All of those pictures that came out during his trial, they got those pictures from former employees who took the pictures and took them to the state to tell them this man is murdering children, and the state of Pennsylvania turned a blind eye. And when the DEA went in and raided his abortion center and found the horrific conditions that they found, they invited the state of Pennsylvania to come in with them, because they didn't know all of the laws that Pennsylvania had regulating abortion. And the head of the Department of Health of Pennsylvania said, "I feel like they set us up." And one of her workers said, "Bingo." Because they didn't care that Kermit Gosnell was murdering babies. They didn't care that he was murdering women. The only reason that Kermit Gosnell is locked up in jail today is because he was running a pill mill, and the DEA took him down, not the state of Pennsylvania. While I was in DC, there was a prayer meeting that was hosted by the Radiance Foundation and Online for Life. And I'm in the prayer meeting, and I get an email that just sent me spiraling even further down, because it was about a young woman named Lakeisha Wilson. Lakeisha was killed in a abortion center in Ohio in March of last year. We suspected something criminal had happened, but we couldn't prove it. We weren't sure. Well, someone sent her record to one of our pro-life organizations, and they looked at her record. Ohio has a limit of 20 weeks for performing an abortion. That's 5 months pregnant. Lakeisha was 23 weeks. The abortion center where she died, the elevator was broken, so they couldn't quickly evacuate her to get her life-saving aid. But even if they had been able to evacuate her in the elevator wasn't big enough to hold a gurney. So they still couldn't have intubated her or did any of the other life-saving procedures because they could not lay her down. Excuse me. The state of Ohio never prosecuted that abortion doctor. They said that Lakeisha died from a heart attack. And to this day, there's no criminal charges that have been filed. In the state of Georgia, where I live, we have some of the best pro-life laws on the books. We have 24-hour waiting period. We have parental notification. We have the ultrasound bill. We got all that stuff, right? There's an abortion center there today that 2 years ago violated the facility code. It is an ambulatory surgical center, but they don't have an elevator in the building. They had gotten an elevator waiver, and the elevator waiver was simple. Escort the patients down the stairs after the surgery, and if there is a need to call the EMTs in, tell them you don't have an elevator so they can bring whatever equipment they need to bring to evacuate the patient, right? Well, Atlanta Women's Medical Center staff told their subordinates, well, you don't need to escort them down the stairs because we've had family members get angry and want to beat you up, beat the workers up, so we're not going to make you put your life in jeopardy. So you don't have to escort them, just tell them to bring someone with them. Well, that violated the elevator waiver. They injured a woman and they called the ambulance to come get her, but they didn't tell them that they didn't have an elevator. So that was the second violation of the elevator waiver. A year later, they injured a second woman under the same conditions. The state went in and investigated, and they found, indeed, you have violated the elevator waiver. We are going to deny you the waiver going forward, so you're no longer a compliant ambulatory surgical center. And yet that surgical center is doing abortions today because the state has not yet shut them down and they are injuring women. The other things that they don't tell us is that the further along you are in the pregnancy, the more danger there is to the woman, that you're probably going to be injured and even killed. There's another young woman that went to a Planned Parenthood at 18 South Michigan Avenue in Chicago. If you go to the Planned Parenthood of 18 South Michigan Avenue's website, they tell you very clearly that they are not a surgical center. If you need a surgical abortion, you have to go to one of these other abortion centers in the state. And yet, they did an abortion on Tanya Reeves, another 22-year-old vibrant young lady. Tanya had a botched abortion at that time. They kept her in that abortion center for 5 hours. They went back in and scraped her uterus an additional 2 times and still did not successfully complete the abortion. 5 hours after the procedure began, they took her to the nearest trauma center that was less than 2 miles down the street. They could have picked Tanya up and carried her in their arms to that trauma center. She did not have to die. When she got to the hospital, they found that she still had parts of the baby inside her. So they completed the abortion. And then they subsequently saw that she had an uncontrollable bleed. But by that time, it was 11 hours after the abortion began, and she coded and she died. The abortionist said it was Tanya's fault, that she had a 2-chamber uterus, which was not true, as proven by the autopsy report. And then it was her boss's her boss's fault, because she told her boss that Tanya's uterus was what they call boggy, meaning they knew something wasn't right because she was still bleeding. So it was her boss's fault because her boss told her she didn't need to call the ambulance. It was everybody's fault except the abortionist. And young Tanya Reeves died. I could do a roll call of the young women that have died in the abortion centers, And in each one of these centers, there was some kind of violation of the pro-life laws on the books. 15-year-old Tamir Russell, impregnated by a 26-year-old man, 6 months pregnant, taken to an abortion facility in Michigan. Her mother said she bled so heavily after the procedure, it literally soaked the mattress. Edrika Good had an infection. They should have sent her home, never starting a second trimester abortion on her. Instead, they put the laminaria in her, which caused the infection to speed up and spread throughout her body, killing her. Toxic shock syndrome. There are so many young people. The young lady that went to see Leroy Carhart in Maryland, Jennifer Morbelli, kindergarten teacher, goes to see Leroy Carhart, and he botches the abortion and leaves and goes to play golf. And when she went into distress, they couldn't find him anywhere. She's dead. So many young women that should never have died. But it's because we're allowing substandard abortion providers to get a pass. And I'm not understanding that. In Texas, when Texas stepped up to the plate and said, we're going to protect our women, we want every abortionist to have admitting privileges to the nearest hospital and to raise their facility to ambulatory surgical center levels, Planned Parenthood and others sent operatives. Those weren't Texans down there ready to throw urine and soiled tampons on the legislators. Those were paid operatives that went in to carry out abortion on demand without restriction. And we don't care that these physicians are substandard physicians. We don't care that these abortionists are raping the women on the table. We don't care that it's a blind procedure and they're pulling out their uteruses and pulling out their bowels. We don't care. We want this to remain legal. Personhood would stop all of that foolishness. Personhood would bring us away from the standard that the pro-abortion organizations have established. Today, they're no longer denying the personhood of the child. Today, I don't know how many of you know it, but Planned Parenthood announced they are moving away from calling it being pro-choice. And they are replacing it with language that basically says if a woman doesn't want to be pregnant, she doesn't have to be. So during the March for Life, where I was so depressed, there was a pro-abortion woman following many of our pro-life leaders, shadowing them throughout the march, hearing their conversations, drinking with them at the pub, the Dubliner pub, and just yucking it up and having a great time with the pro-life leaders. And she wrote an article that talked about her experience. And she ended her article saying this: I will never, ever believe that the rights of a life developing in the womb outweigh the rights of the person carrying it, or that she has an obligation once pregnant to provide society with a live, full-term infant, regardless of her own emotional or medical needs. In other words, she's telling us very clearly that the baby in the womb has no right to life. But our Constitution says differently. Our Constitution says that that baby in the womb is a person. And so we must go back and pick up the mantle of personhood. We can no longer afford to allow politics to rule the day. Politics allowed partial birth abortion for years. Politics is allowing substandard abortion providers to mutilate women each and every day. Politics allows our politicians to get a pat on the back when they vote for a piece of legislation that has the rape and incest exception in it. They can say, well, I voted pro-life. So you're going to kill the baby for the sins of the father. God said we no longer do that. God said, I will no longer visit the sins of the father on the child. Why are we going against what God said? So our politicians have to be told they can end abortion today. All they need to do is pass the Sanctity of Human Life Act. And it will do for the baby what the Civil Rights Act of 1964 did for blacks in this country. So I encourage you to join me, to join all of the organizations today that are supporting personhood. Let us stop playing Russian roulette with the lives of women and babies, and let us take a principled stand and demand the passage of the Sanctity of Human Life Act. And with that, I'll take any questions you may have.
Any questions?
Oh, wow.
I have a question. My family, wife, are not here yet, but some background, she's black. We've had this discussion so many times. It's my observation that blacks are way, way more spiritual than whites in America. But yet, the number of black abortions far, far outnumber that of whites. Why do you think there's a disconnect between spirituality of blacks to abortion and life issues?
Because we have not connected the dots between our spirituality and civil rights. See, the abortion industry, they can be smart on occasion. And they went to black women and they told them, we're going to give you a new right. No longer will the slave master be able to impregnate you and you have to bear the indignity of having their child. We're going to give you the right to control how you and when you have children so you can evenly space them. And we drank that Kool-Aid, lock, stock, and barrel because of the racial history in this nation. But black women and black people are waking up. And people like me are going around the country and we are sounding the alarm. There is a movie called Maafa 21, M-A-A-F-A, and the number 21. You can watch it for free on YouTube. And it is a documentary that documents the history, the racial impetus behind abortion in this country, behind Planned Parenthood and Margaret Sanger. As we are introducing that in many of the churches, black churches around the country, we are waking them up to the fact that abortion is the latest legalized government discrimination in the country. Congressman Trent Franks introduced a PRENDA bill, Pregnancy Non-Discrimination Act is what it was called. And that bill basically called attention to the fact that there are abortionists and people who want to abort a child because of its race or because of its gender. Trent's bill, honestly, wouldn't have stopped abortions, but it did call attention to the racial impetus undergirding abortion and the gender side that is happening around the country. And Trent called me on my birthday. I was in Connecticut visiting family. I'm originally from Connecticut. And my sister and her husband were throwing me a good old birthday cookout, and we were going to have all of my most favorite meals. And Trent called and said, "Catherine, I really need to talk to you." And I said, "Trent, I don't want to talk to you today. It's my birthday. And I've got a feeling you're going to give me some bad news, and I don't want." He's like, "No, I really need for you to talk to you today because of what's going to happen tomorrow." And what they did was put the rape and incest exception into that bill. And then, rape and incest, I'm sorry, and then they took out race. They completely removed the race issue from the bill. That was the whole impetus of the bill. And they completely removed it from the bill, and of course it died. It died. It was a sad day in America that our so-called pro-life congresspersons, men and women, played political shenanigans with a bill that may have slowed down the racial and gender abortions in this country. It wouldn't have ended it, but by golly, it certainly put the spotlight on what organizations like Planned Parenthood and NARAL and others are doing. It's a sad day. The question is, how can we get men to stand up and be men on this issue of abortion? How can we get them more involved? Because the other side, the feminists, very clearly have erased men from the spectrum of men, belittled them. And I think the short answer to that is it's not easy. The abortion vested the right in the woman, not in the man. And while many of us know and believe that men in many instances encourage abortions, many don't. Many want their children. Many want to be able to take that child and raise that child and be responsible for that child, but the right has been vested in the woman. So it is hard, but we can encourage those principled men to stand up and speak out. Now, many may not want to do it because they'll be vilified like not Trent Franks. What's the guy from Ohio that they belittled? Was it Ohio? Missouri. From Missouri that they belittled in the election. Aikens, yeah. You run the risk of being belittled and put down and marginalized, but I think we have to do what Matt said. I don't care. Principles will set you free. The truth will make you free, and we have to encourage our men to stand up. And quite frankly, ladies, I want to say this with all of the boldness that's in me. You know, I told you the name of my book is The Fight for Life, Taking It to the Street. We got to stop letting these women punk our men. We have to stand up for our men and stop allowing these rabidly feminist, pro-whatever women to belittle our men. When they do that, we got to push back and say, you better back up, because it's our man. You know, God has not blessed me with a husband yet, and if he's here in Alaska, would y'all tell him I'm in Georgia? But there's no way on God's green earth I'm going to let some rabidly feminist woman who's confused about who and what she is belittle my man. I'm just not going to have it. So ladies, the onus is on us. Yeah, we need to encourage our men, but we need to be pushing back on these women that want to make our men into punks. We can't continue to let that happen. Amen? Thank you again. Oh, yes, ma'am. Maafa 21. M-A-A-F-A and the number 21. Maafa 21. It is an excellent documentary. Excellent documentary. And again, if any of you want to know how strange my mind is, I do have a few copies of my book here for sale as well. God bless you all. Thank you.
Thank you.